Welcome back to the FITSNews studio. It is time for another edition of your Week in Review. I am Will Folks, the founding editor of FITSNews.com. Thank you for joining us. We've got a ton to cover this week. After months of relative silence on the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption front, this past week was Murdoch mayhem. We've got a ton of big developments to cover. Jen Wood and I are going to sit down and walk you through each one of those. I'm also going to sit down with Dylan Nolan, who has become basically our political swami. You've heard about us breaking big news, but Dylan Nolan has basically got a crystal ball as to what's happening in the presidential election. We're going to sit down with him and see what he's predicting for the next few months as President Joe Biden continues to battle a soft coup within his own party. All that and more is heading your way on the Week in Review. So for the past 5 months, it has been relatively quiet, comparatively quiet, on the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption front. Obviously, earlier this year, January 29, a major decision regarding Alec Murdaugh's bid for a new trial. That bid was shot down by former South Carolina Chief Justice Jean Toll at a hearing on January 29 of this year in Columbia, South Carolina. And at that point, we felt the stage was set for a broader appeal, that Alec Murdaugh's attorneys would begin that long, arduous process of reviewing 10,000 pages of documents related to the court transcript from his first trial and file their appeal with the South Carolina Court of Appeals. But again, for the last 5 months, it's been quiet on the Murdoch front with a few exceptions. But this week, the floodgates opened. And I'm joined by Jen Wood to talk about this deluge of Murdoch-related news that we've experienced over the past 3 to 4 days this past week. And Jen, I wanted to start with a bit of news that broke exclusively here on FITSNews related to the saga of the Murdoch juror, the egg juror, if you'll recall, who was dismissed from the jury the day the guilty verdicts were handed down against Alec Murdoch. This was a decisive dismissal as, again, sources close to that jury had indicated that she was not going along with the rest of the jury in their desire to convict Alec Murdoch, and that had she remained on the panel, she would have, in fact, hung that jury. Jen, we had a big development this week regarding the egg juror, and I wanted to talk with you a little bit about it here and get your sense of where this story is going. But what we learned this week was that a court filing had been submitted by the egg juror's attorney, Joe McCulloch, and a lawyer in Columbia, South Carolina, to have documents related to the investigation which booted her from that panel, have those released, to have that information be made publicly available. Now, apparently this was something that the egg juror was consenting to, that her counsel obviously was consenting to, and that Mr. Murdoch's attorneys, Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, were consenting to. Seemed like a pretty routine release of information, but apparently the Office of South Carolina Attorney General, and specifically lead Murdoch prosecutor Creighton Waters, declined to support the release of this sealed information. Jen, let me ask you, let's start off with the first question. Why won't they let this information out? What is in these files?
Well, I think the biggest question is who makes that decision to unseal them? Judge Clifton Newman made the decision to seal them. He's no longer on the bench overseeing this case. And if there's, a request to unseal them, does that go through the court, or is it the AG's office that makes that decision? So, it may be as simple as it's not even in their purview, but then they responded to you via statement, right?
No, that's correct.
So their rationale is that there is, ongoing, what was the exact wording? Ongoing.
Ongoing matters.
So not necessarily an investigation, but, they were not inclined to release it at this time because of ongoing matters. What are those ongoing matters?
Yeah, I think that's the big question. And what's interesting about this is, again, a lot of stuff was sealed during the Murdoch trial. Some of it arguably should be sealed. There's some very graphic information there that probably isn't fit for public consumption, and can certainly understand why those files would be sealed and remain sealed. Again, I would argue journalists should have been able to have access to those during the trial to make judgments about the evidence in this case. We were not allowed to do that. We had to find those through other means. But I can argue that that's not fit for public consumption. But Jen, these are documents related to the removal of a juror involving allegations against the clerk of court who was accused of tampering with that jury, and in fact, allegedly rigging that jury. So there's a lot of really sensitive allegations here. And by the way, that clerk of court, Becky Hill, has since resigned from office, has since been under criminal investigation on a multitude of different fronts, has had multiple ethics complaints filed against her, several of which have since been referred for criminal prosecution. So this is not just a, I mean, this is central to the integrity of these verdicts, is it not?
Yeah, it is central to the integrity of the verdicts. And I think, at this point, and this is just my opinion, transparency right now is critical to rebuild trust, public trust in the judicial system in South Carolina. And, I've seen a number of instances, we'll get into another one later, but that this week where it's just people in power are not understanding that need.
Yeah, and all this is happening obviously in anticipation of the launch of this juror's book. It's coming out apparently next month in
August
August.
27th is the date that I've heard lately.
All right, and again, we're referring to her exclusively as Juror 785, the egg juror. We're not naming her. Apparently, she's going to reveal herself when the book comes out, and maybe some interviews. Who knows exactly what the plan is there? But we're sticking to not naming this individual juror. But Jen, I wanted to ask you, any tea leaves that you've discerned regarding this upcoming book from Juror 785 from the egg juror?
I think, I haven't read it yet, but my understanding of the book, just in talking to those close to the process, is that, it really gives her point of view of the trial from a juror's perspective. And, we haven't seen a lot of information come out regarding her dismissal. So it gives, what she experienced in the process of being dismissed in detail. The things that we heard, in affidavits were pretty limited. But I think she's going into it in more detail, what she experienced and, the things that people didn't hear about.
Absolutely. And obviously, the egg juror was not invited to testify at the big retrial hearing for Alec Murdaugh back in January of this year. That was a decision made by Justice Jean Toll. But let's move now, Jen. Obviously, we'll be looking forward to the egg juror's book, and we'll see what it has to say about all these different matters and that very consequential decision to kick her off of that jury. But Jen, let's move now to the second big Murdaugh news that broke this week. And I would argue this is perhaps the biggest Murdaugh news that broke this week, which was a filing before the South Carolina Supreme Court by Alec Murdaugh's attorneys, again, Dick Harpootlian, Jim Griffin, Phil Barber, Maggie Fox, his defense team. They've been with him from the beginning of this case. They are continuing to advocate for his interest in both federal and state courts. But Jen, this filing, a very significant filing, and it's also worth pointing out, it's a departure from what we were initially told about the next steps in this case. Initially, we were told that Murdaugh would be folding the issue of the new trial and whether or not he should have been granted one into his broader appeal, which is currently situated at the South Carolina Court of Appeals. Instead, they have decided to petition Justice Jean Toll's decision about denying Murdaugh a new trial. They've decided to take that straight to the state Supreme Court. Is that the gist of what this filing was about?
Yeah, at least attempt to. It's called a motion for certification. And that was basically, it's filed in cases with, extreme legal precedents where, they're asking the court to review something that, is of great public interest, and it involves a very, complicated, debated legal issue. So that was filed this week. It did not see it coming, 650 pages. But basically,
Well,
they're
with the
asking,
exhibits.
yeah, with the exhibits,
With the
which
exhibits.
we have
The
for
main
the most
filing
part
is,
seen. Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, it's but yeah, no, it basically, the gist of it is, they're filing a motion with the Supreme Court asking them to to review the decision that Justice Jean Toll made and rule on it bypassing the Court of Appeals. So
Right.
it was an interesting motion. I'm not a lawyer, so I didn't even know that was an option.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And a couple of things at play here that I think our audience would be very interested in knowing. The Supreme Court, which will hear this request from Alec Murdaugh, is going to be dramatically different from the Supreme Court, which has been responsible for overseeing this case. And I'm referring to the impending, I believe it's 2.5, 3 weeks from now, the impending resignation of Chief Justice Donald Beatty. Donald Beatty's impact on the Murdaugh case, folks, it cannot be overstated. He is the one who appointed Clifton Newman to preside over the initial trial. He is the one who tasked former Chief Justice Jean Toll to oversee the evidentiary hearing on Murdaugh's bid for a new trial. So this is a guy who's been pulling the levers behind the scenes from the beginning, and I think most would argue he has not pulled them in a direction favorable to Alec Murdaugh. I don't think anyone, at least certainly at the beginning, had a real problem with that, but as we've seen some questions raised about the integrity of these guilty verdicts, there's been a little more concern about perhaps Chief Justice Beatty having his thumb on the scale, Jen, but now he's going to be off the court. The new Chief Justice is John Kittredge. We have a new justice on the court, Letitia Verdon from the South Carolina upstate, a very straight and narrow, calls balls and strikes type justice. So an entirely new court will be hearing these arguments. Jen, you've looked over some of the arguments. What's the basic legal point that Alec Murdaugh's attorneys are making in this new filing?
So it's really the burden of proof that his defense was required to meet when proving that the jury was influenced by an outside source. Justice Jean Toll followed the verdict, a statewide verdict, given State versus, I believe, Green, where it is it is up to the defense to prove that a juror had been influenced.
Right. That was was prejudicial to the client.
Yes. So that's she made that ruling based on state court, but there is a number of United States Supreme Court rulings relating to juror influence of juror by outside sources, including one that many of you are now familiar with, Rummer versus United States. And that one's where the Supreme Court unanimously held that in a criminal case, any tampering with a juror about a trial is deemed presumptively prejudicial. So the burden of proof would have shifted to the state if they had used that.
No, you're right. And also it's worth noting the circuit courts here in the United States are split on applying that Rimmer presumption in jury tampering cases, but the federal court with jurisdiction over South Carolina has held that Rimmer is the law of the land. And so I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of this motion from Alec Murdaugh's attorneys, was to point out to these Supreme Court justices at the state level is, hey guys, you've got a judge who is basically rewriting the law as it relates to the federal standard here in South Carolina. Do you really want to let her do that? Or, because that's to me is what sets up the appeal for Alec Murdaugh at the federal level, Jen.
Right.
Right. Let me ask you this question, because we reviewed a lot of these arguments. We've had great experts come on, including Lauren Taylor from Lauren Taylor Law, who has come on this show. She's discussed some of the very particular nuances of these different standards. But I wanted to ask you this question because we talked about this earlier this week as the fallout from this big filing began to reverberate across the Murdaugh sphere, I guess we call it. But one of the things that stood out to me is how deftly those Supreme Court justices here in South Carolina, they are really on the spot right now. Because if they do not take this case and essentially say that the Chief Justice Toll's ruling stands, that puts this case very squarely in the new trial realm on the federal level.
Right.
But it also would, I believe, fast track that bigger appeal. Because remember, all this is just a question of whether he deserves a new trial on jury tampering. This has nothing to do with that broader appeal of the various issues that Murdaugh's lawyers raised um, during that trial and have raised since about whether or not, this circumstantial case should have even, I think, been brought in the first place. Some of the allegations against SLED regarding the initial affidavits for Alec Murdaugh's, murder charges. I mean, they're going to go deep on a number of issues, Jen, aren't they?
Yeah, there. I think it's going to be very interesting to watch and see how they handle this. And we discussed, the next steps. The state does have 10 days to file their response. And then, from what I could tell in research, the timing on these motions for certification typically, it depends on the complexity of the issue that's being reviewed. But the timing of it typically is, 2, 3, 4 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, once again, it's important to state for the record, I think this guy did it.
Yeah.
I think at the very least he had help doing it. At the very, very least, he knows who did it and is not saying anything about it. But I think the verdict was correct. I probably would have voted the same if I had been on that jury. I think it was a circumstantial case, but the evidence was overwhelming. I think he's where he needs to be. I also think it's worth pointing out that whatever happens with this appeal, he's not getting out of jail anytime soon because he's pleaded guilty to a host of financial crimes at the state and federal level, which will keep him locked up for decades. But the process matters here, Jen. And if that jury tampering, which is, again, several jurors have now testified to it, one even testifying that it changed her mind, that it impacted her judgment. I mean, that is not something we can just write off. And I think that this appeal by Murdaugh's attorneys brings that back to the forefront, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's, it matters because, yeah, I think he's where he belongs. He should be in prison. But, the way that you get there, if you can't get a fair trial with the world watching in South Carolina, I mean, every person indicted should be concerned about their ability to get a fair trial. It doesn't matter what you're indicted for.
Absolutely. It is not about Alec Murdaugh or any other defendant. It is about the integrity of the process, the integrity of the verdicts that are handed down. And there are real questions here. And Jen, that moves us into the third big Murdoch news that broke this week, which kind of piggybacks on the first thing that we were talking about. And I wanted to kind of recap this. So we've talked about the refusal of the Attorney General's office to release information related to the removal of a juror who was believed to be sympathetic to Alec Murdaugh. We have now talked about how the South Carolina courts may have erred in determining that nothing bad happened with that jury verdict, that everything was okay, that no tampering reached the level of denying Alec Murdaugh his constitutional rights. But now we are going to talk about the third big Murdaugh development today, Jen Wood, and it was the referral, and I'm using air quotes there to signify some dismissiveness or skepticism regarding that word, but the referral of the criminal cases, or some of the criminal cases, involving clerk of court Becky Hill, the one who allegedly tampered with this jury, the referral of those cases to a solicitor here in Lexington County, South Carolina, Rick Hubbard, very solid solicitor. He's a guy who's taken on some high-profile defendants, won some huge cases, one of the most skilled prosecutors in the state. But Jen, they didn't really refer the case to Solicitor Hubbard, did they? What is this letter we've
No,
got
I
here
mean,
this week?
we had heard that this was a possibility that likely they would refer it, based on the conflict. And the referral, when we got it, we looked at it and we're like, wait, this isn't a typical referral. It's sort of a referral.
Well, explain that way. I'll walk us through it.
Yeah, so the letter basically it gives him, I'm reading through it so I make sure I get the words right. Um, it basically, the AG staff is heavily involved. It's my understanding that Creighton Waters has met with him. And this limited designation may be revoked at any time. I mean, it's not your typical. He's overseeing it, but it's limited in scope. And Creighton Waters and Deputy Attorney General Don Zelinka, Chief Deputy Attorney General Jeff Young, and Assistant Attorney General Ben Elfin have been assigned to assist him. So they are still heavily involved.
Right. In fact, it said that they would be basically signing off on the decisions, any prosecutorial decisions, which
Right.
in my mind, that doesn't make this a referral at all, does it?
No, no.
All right. So does this concern you, Jen, though? Because I mean, we're talking now about kind of a layered issue here with the denial of the trial records, the questionable nature of this appeal, the now all of a sudden a limited designation for an outside prosecutor.
Yeah, it does concern me. I mean, all I've ever wanted is, in this stuff is transparency. Just be transparent, do the right thing, and they've got a vested interest in that verdict sticking. And if any of these, investigations are tied to potential jury tampering, I just don't. I mean, I honestly, I didn't think SLED should even be investigating it. I thought it should have been, referred out due to conflict of interest. Everybody involved in that investigation has has a vested interest in that verdict standing.
Right. And the fact that that referral letter specifically referenced Creighton Waters in such a prominent way, I mean, that's very concerning because I think you could argue no one is more invested in preserving that verdict than Creighton Waters. Now, we have taken our concerns to the Attorney General in the past. Again, let's not forget FITSNews before this hearing even took place in January. We were all over these conflicts. We were pointing out these conflicts. We were calling on the Attorney General's office and SLED to do the right thing and recuse themselves. But now, Jen, we're in a situation that ship has obviously sailed. We're kind of in a position where we got to trust them that there's no there, so to speak. And I'm with you. Show us the documents. Show us the files. I fully expected them to sign off on the release of those
Right, like
juror
here,
files.
we're going to sign off. There's nothing here. Just take them.
Yeah.
The person who we're trying to protect in these files, she's okay with it. Here they are, and everything that happens like that makes me question: is there a reason? Is there a reason they're not showing this stuff? Is there a reason they're not handing the investigation over for a true, independent decision on prosecution? I I don't want to question it. I want it to be clear cut. I want it to be transparent. I want to feel like it's getting done right because I'm tired.
Yeah, I think everybody, but again, the surge of interest in this case, just every time something happens, a new development like the news that broke this week, we see the chatter and the buzz build again. But Jen, it just reminds me of that old adage: two wrongs don't make a right. I mean, we're dealing with a family, the Murdoch family, that ruled this multi-county area down in the South Carolina Low Country like their own political fiefdom for years. They were the law. If they wanted you charged, you were charged. If they wanted you to get off, you got off. They owned that court system down there, and so I think the corruption that was emblematic of the Murdoch regime, this trial, this whole process was supposed to expose it and hold it accountable. But now we're in a situation once again where we're seeing some of the same funny business behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean that what Alex Murdoch was able to do in terms of the crimes that he admitted to committing, that he has been put in prison for, the financial crimes, what he was able to do didn't happen in a vacuum. He didn't do it alone. Corey Fleming and Russell Lafitte weren't the only two bozos involved in it with him. I mean, I expected to see, we kept hearing at the beginning, there's a public corruption investigation ongoing. This is a huge, this is bigger than Ozark. You won't ever understand how complicated this is. And in the end, it just feel
Yeah,
like,
where'd all that go?
where did it
Where are
go?
all those loose ends?
And
Well,
trust
you're
me,
working on a piece.
yeah, I am working. Yeah, I am working on a big piece. Should be out soon. The loose ends. What is still hanging out there, and there's a lot. I still have a lot of questions that are unanswered, and I know they need to be answered because I have researched this extensively, and I know what they were saying about the public corruption, and the Ozark comparisons. That's not far fetched.
No, it's not. And also, once again, we're in a situation where if there was uh, a legitimate tampering incident, if there are or were legitimate issues with the integrity of the verdicts, there was an opportunity early on to deal with that. But now we're in a situation where, Jen, I hate to say it, but I like the guy's chances of getting a new trial, certainly at the federal level, but I think his chances at the state level are looking a lot better after this filing. I mean, do you agree or disagree?
I mean, I know everybody gives Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, a hard time. They're defense attorneys. This our justice system would not work without good defense attorneys. That motion, like I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I was reading through that motion very carefully, and it was a tight motion. I
Yeah.
felt like the arguments were very well made. And I don't want to do a new trial. I really don't. I want this. That was 6 weeks of my
Yeah, we've
life.
been covering a ton of other
Yeah,
stuff. We've been
yeah,
covering a ton of other stuff.
yeah. I
We've been
mean,
enjoying covering other
it's
stuff.
not like we're saying this because we want a new trial because we're invested in it. I'm saying. I mean, I just think that the chances are good after reading that.
Yeah. And let's be honest, we're saying it because number one, we believe it. And we're saying it number two, because we have spent years fighting to fix the broken judicial system in South Carolina. And if it's broken for Alec Murdaugh, it could be broken for anybody. And so, Murdoch abused it habitually for years to rip off a ton of people, vulnerable people. I believe he's exactly where he belongs. But the fact remains there are serious questions regarding the integrity of the murder verdicts that were handed down. But Jen, as we head out of this big Murdoch segment, obviously a ton to unpack. We're going to be talking about this stuff again in future weeks because there's so much that happened this week. But there was another development in a case that has long been viewed as Murdoch adjacent. I don't know if we can call it that anymore, but let's talk briefly about what happened this week in the case of Stephen Smith. For those of you who have been following our website, you know this case intimately. Stephen Smith, a teenager from Hampton County, South Carolina, body was found in the middle of a road near Crocketville, South Carolina, a horrific head wound. It was initially believed to have been a gunshot wound. It was later controversially classified as a vehicular hit and run, but an investigation into his death opened in the aftermath of the Murdoch saga coming to light in the spring of 2021. The State Law Enforcement Division has been investigating that for years. This past week, there were certain circles argued that Paul Murdoch, the deceased son of Alec Murdoch, the one he allegedly killed, or killed, according to that Colleton County jury, on June 7, 2021, there were some circles were raising speculation that Paul Murdoch had been involved in the death of Stephen Smith. Well, we reached out to our law enforcement sources, folks who are very close to this investigation. They asserted with absolute certainty zero credibility to that rumor, zero credibility to the rumors that Paul Murdoch had anything to do with the death of Stephen Smith. But again, it's obviously still an open case, Jen.
Yeah, it's still open. It's been almost a decade. It's sad that it hasn't been solved. But yeah, it's still a very open and sounds like active investigation by SLED. Like any hit and run accident, murder, I mean, homicide, I don't know what the right word is. They're
Yeah.
tough to solve. I mean, they are tough to solve in the best of situations. And this was obviously a less than ideal situation for investigators. And we're looking at, years and years have gone by. So I do hope it is solved one day for his family, but it's going to be hard. It's going to require somebody talking, coming forward, new evidence being found.
Well, we believe we know what happened. And again, the forensic evidence that has been exposed over the course of this investigation, folks have weighed in on this, and it appears now that it was some sort of a fast moving mirror or some sort of object jutting off of a truck or some other vehicle that struck him in the head. What he was doing in the middle of the road, I don't know. How he wound up where he did in the middle of the road, I don't know. But the rumors of a baseball bat hitting him, the rumors of a gunshot wound, all that has been put to bed pretty conclusively. But again, it wasn't, as you mentioned, a conventional hit and run, because whatever hit him, there were no parts of a vehicle left at the scene. There were only a few minor paint flecks that were found that were in any way consistent with a vehicular strike. And in fact, there was great debate among investigators in that Stephen Smith case about whether he'd even been hit by a car. Most of them determined he had not been. So, but obviously, Jen, a number of suspects have been named in connection with that. A lot of folks said Buster Murdoch did it. He has now filed a big batch of lawsuits against some of the outlets that accused him or hinted that he had been involved. But Jen, what do you think of that? That initial speculation, though, regarding the Murdoch connection, was the initial speculation at least somewhat grounded? What do you think?
I mean, yeah, I mean, Murdoch name is in that report quite a few times, in that Mate investigative report from back when it happened. I mean, I think, with SLED saying that they were going to open an investigation into it in the aftermath of the Murdochs, Paul and Maggie Murdoch's homicides, in combination with, the presence of that name in the report. Yeah. I mean, I think early on speculation was reasonable.
Yeah, it wasn't people just pulling it out of their backside. Right. And, there was some credible speculation, but have we reached a point now, though, where that speculation is less founded? Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah, I think that speculation at this point is irresponsible. It's, I hate to say that, but, it's I feel like it's been years. They found no substantial ties to Buster Murdoch. In fact, we've been told by some of our sources that he had an alibi. He wasn't even in Hampton County. He wasn't in Colleton County. So, keep bringing, them back into this unless there is, obvious proof, it just doesn't feel right to me.
Absolutely. Well, we also heard from our investigatory sources very close to this investigation, that the two individuals that were named as persons of interest remain persons of interest in this case. And so, the reports we'd heard this week about that being some sort of dirty police work or something that was tied to their emergence in the investigation, that's also not true. They were persons of interest. They remain persons of interest. Connolly and Wilson, I believe, are the two young men's names. But Jen, the other big thing as we close the door on the Stephen Smith segment for this week anyway, the chance that this case may never be solved.
Yeah. I mean, just, it's been a long time, and SLED has been actively investigating it, looking for answers. At this point, I always hope it is. I don't want a family to ever not have answers. So, it's hard for me to say, but, absent somebody stepping forward and saying something, there's a chance it may not.
Somebody knows what happened, that's for sure. Somebody knows what happened, and gosh, just for that family, again, they've been through a lot. Sandy Smith, obviously not the biggest fan of this media outlet, but that's okay. We're going to still continue to push for justice for her son, as are a lot of other folks in this process. But as we do that, we also need to just bear in mind that you got to base it on something. You've got to have something to hang your hat on as you throw these theories out there. So it's important to rely on outlets that have the sources that know what's happening with the investigation, as opposed to mere, as you mentioned, irresponsible speculation. Count on this news outlet to continue to report on these cases based on that accurate information. And again, stay tuned as the Murdoch saga, which again had laid dormant for multiple months, back with a vengeance this week. Jen Wood, thanks for joining me, Jen, and appreciate all your incredible work.
Thank you.
You've done amazing work on this story, and we'll be on the lookout for your loose ends article this week.
All right.
So we deviated a bit from the norm last week by starting with a political block. Obviously, politics was Fitt's claim to fame, but the news from last week was just so big, so deafening, echoing across the country, we just couldn't ignore it. The drama surrounding incumbent U.S. President Joe Biden in the aftermath of an absolutely disastrous debate performance in Atlanta, Georgia. And in the weeks since that performance, we have seen a gradual, I've been calling it a soft coup, but certainly a squeeze play on the part of many prominent Democrats to oust Biden from the race. Perhaps even some discussion about invoking the 25th Amendment on the president, which would place Kamala Harris in charge of the country. Frightening thought there, isn't it, Dylan Nolan? You've been tracking this evolution. You've been following this. We talked about it a little bit last week, but you are kind of the guy that called this several months ago when we were on this show, how Biden's popularity or lack thereof was presenting a real problem for Democrats, and that your assessment at the time was that he would be booted from the ticket. That is inching closer to reality, Dylan.
It's true, but we should note that there is no official mechanism to force Biden to withdraw other than, the John F. Kennedy special. So unless they go that route, they are going to have to convince him. Now, the pressure is mounting. There's been a lot of reporting this week that the NATO summit, which for folks don't know, it's been taking place this week in D.C. All of the NATO world leaders have been in D.C. The word has been that there's been a push by Democrat leadership not to undermine the president while the other world leaders are here. And regardless of what you think of Joe Biden, I think that's wise for preserving the integrity and the respect of America on the world stage. That being said, it will be interesting to see if there are folks who have been holding their fire now that that summit is over.
You say that, but then we've got Nancy Pelosi, arguably the most powerful Democrat in Washington, D.C., next to Biden, I guess, going on television saying, it's time for him to think about it. Well, Biden has apparently already thought about it and said numerous times he's staying in the race. So what does Pelosi signal there? And also, Dylan, what does it say that she's got to say it on television?
It's very interesting. It kind of reminds me of when a jury says to the judge, "We can't reach a verdict." And the judge says, "Well, why don't you go and consider reaching a verdict some more?" It's like not taking no for an answer here. It's clear, as much as Pelosi's not going to come and knife Biden completely, I mean, that answer right there is very telling. It means that from the very top of Democrat leadership, they want him out.
Right. So we're talking about a president who has been very reticent to give interviews, who's been very carefully managed and scripted for what we now know are obvious reasons. But in recent weeks, in the aftermath of this terrible debate debacle, Biden has gone on several, PR offensive gambits. The interview with George Stephanopoulos from last week. He had a big press conference just this week, and he's got another interview coming up on Monday of the coming week with Lester Holt of NBC. Dylan, these interviews have not been without their gaffes. The press conference, certainly he had a couple.
It's interesting. So let's start with that interview last Friday. George Stephanopoulos aired on primetime. George Stephanopoulos came out early this week and said, after this one-on-one conversation with the president, which everyone can go and watch that and take whatever they will from it, but George Stephanopoulos himself certainly, I mean, he's a former Democrat operative turned member of the media, so he's a literal partisan Democrat, said, "I don't believe Joe Biden's fit to continue serving as president."
Oh, wow. And then we saw, obviously, in the press conference, the NATO press conference, there were some high-profile gaffes.
Yeah, of course, President Biden introduced President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, as Vladimir Putin. I mean, this would be like FDR introducing Churchill as Adolf Hitler.
Well, and then you had him introduce his own or reference his own vice president as...
Right, and he called Kamala Harris Donald Trump.
So, obviously, these gaffes are all over social media. They're getting pumped out by the partisan crowd. But I wanted to cut to a clip from that press conference that I found a little more concerning. And this is a reference to, again, the issues at play, NATO. And in one instance, he remarks that he's not ready to talk to Vladimir Putin, but literally within a minute says that he would talk to any leader, including Putin. Let's cut to that clip from this press conference, Dylan.
Is Putin ready to talk? I'm not ready to talk to Putin. I'm prepared to talk to any leader who wants to talk, including if Putin called me and wanted to talk.
Now, what you hear that, you see something like that, combined with these other gaffes, we've heard some folks suggest the man has Parkinson's. What do you think when you see that sort of instant, lapse?
I mean, clearly he's having some sort of mental problems and some sort of health issue. I'm not a physician. I'm not qualified to diagnose what it is. However, I believe it was MSNBC had a physician on who runs a Parkinson's clinic. And he once again said, hey, look, I'm a partisan Democrat, and I'm just very upset that my party had years to pick a qualified candidate because I see a dozen people like this in my clinic every day, and that is Parkinson's. So there are people who know what they're talking about who have come to that conclusion, but it's certainly disturbing, and I can't imagine being one of these NATO ally world leaders who obviously, the United States contributes the most money by far to that alliance. We make the big decisions, knowing that the guy at the top of the ticket, at least as the figurehead, he's certainly not the one making the military decisions. He literally said in this press conference, I listened to my commander-in-chief. You are the commander-in-chief. But, it would certainly be, if you're Emmanuel Macron or whatever one of these other leaders who is allied with us, knowing that the guy at the top of the ticket there is checked out mentally, it's got to be a little concerning.
Yeah, very disconcerting. Also interesting, I want to point out as we segue from Biden into the Republican nominee for president this fall, Donald Trump, as we segue into that, I do want to point out regarding the NATO issue, and we've written a lot about it at FITSNews, but the Speaker of the House came out and was going on record saying that all those NATO countries need to live up to the terms of their agreement and appropriate at least 2% of their budgets toward defense rather than relying on American taxpayers to subsidize their defense. So it was interesting to see, a neocon like Speaker Johnson, who was very supportive of the Ukraine funding, coming out now and sort of taking a more Trumpian tone as it relates to those European countries.
Yeah, I put very little stock in what members of Congress say, and I look at what they do. And Johnson, as you say, legislates like a neocon, so I believe he is a neocon, and these are mostly just words.
Well, let's talk now a little bit about Trump and the state of play in this election. Obviously, Biden's debacle and the subsequent soft coup or squeeze play, whatever we want to call it, have had a deleterious impact on his polling position. He was already trailing Trump in several battleground states. That margin has now extended. If you look in those, again, 5 to 7 key battleground states, we're talking Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, some say North Carolina, I'm not buying that, Pennsylvania. His lead has increased in most of those states since the debate, and it's also worth noting that it has increased not only in a head-to-head context, but in that five-way race when you throw in the Green Party, when you throw in Cornel West, when you throw in Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And also it was very telling this week, Dylan, that the Democrats, the Democratic National Committee, started to train their fire more on RFK Jr. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, if you look, if you just are taking a head-to-head Biden-Trump, it's a lot closer of a race. But once you start including these other candidates, they're taking more away from Joe Biden than they are from Donald Trump. And that makes sense. If you're somebody who wants the president to implement left-leaning policy, RFK certainly will do that. He is certainly somebody who has espoused his belief in, quasi-socialistic policies throughout his career. Now, would I, if I were a Democrat voter, vote for RFK? No, because I would feel like I'm throwing my vote away because the odds that he wins are infinitesimally small. That being said, the odds that enough people come out there and just protest vote for RFK because they can in good conscience vote for somebody who obviously has dementia or Parkinson's or whatever it might be could seriously impact the race, which I believe is why they are looking into this more now.
Indeed. No third-party candidate has ever captured the presidency, no independent candidate. The closest two former presidents, Teddy Roosevelt and Millard Fillmore. They actually both garnered more than 20% of the popular
I'm still
vote.
hoping that we bring back the Bull Moose Party. That's the best party name that's ever existed.
I mean, you got to love a guy who can get shot in the chest while giving a speech and finish his speech before seeking medical care. I don't think Biden could be able to do that, Dylan.
I don't think
He can't
anybody
even
who's
give a
held the
speech
Oval
without a
Office.
bullet.
Yeah, no.
Well, let's pivot a little bit to Trump because I know you and I, we've had conversations in the office a little bit, kind of going back and forth on some of the Trump developments. From this media outlet's perspective, I've always tried to take an agnostic tone with Trump. People say, do you like Trump or no? I always tell them, well, on what issue? What, do I like him on immigration? Yes. Do I like him on foreign policy? Yes. Do I like him for keeping his word on tax cuts for the middle class? Not so much. Do I like him on reining in federal spending? No,
Not at all.
Not at all. But let's talk about this because there was something that happened this week regarding the Republican National Platform, which previously clearly articulated the right to life as an inalienable human right, one that the federal government was obligated to protect, and one that the Republican Party would fight for, again, unequivocally. That hard language has been removed from the party platform for 2024. It has been replaced by a throw to the 14th Amendment, saying, oh, well, the 14th Amendment provides equal protection, life, liberty, happiness to all Americans. And we're going to let that be our life position. The only specific abortion-related measure that the platform opposes is late-term abortions. Dylan, is this shift a good idea? Trump's behind it, obviously, but is this shift a good idea? Will it help Trump and Republicans in the fall?
You know, it's interesting. I think the shift is not a good idea if, you want to appease certain activist groups within the GOP and the people that are already hard GOP voters. That being said, if those people want any Republicans to have a future in D.C., they need to acknowledge that by knocking down Roe v. Wade, they've now created a political obstacle for themselves, which needs to be overcome if they don't just want the 2022 midterms to be the permanent state of the GOP, which, if folks remember, the GOP was predicted to have a red wave and got demolished in that set of elections, which happened directly after Roe v. Wade. Trump is, making a play saying federalism is what is going to keep America together. And as a conservative, I believe that a lot of issues right now, which are federal issues outside of abortion, should be turned back to the states to let the states decide. So if you want to take that federalist approach, that's fair. That's where he's coming from. But I do think political reality, whether you think abortion is healthcare or abortion is murder, is that the Republican Party needs to take a stance like this to have electoral viability in national elections.
Well, let's rewind that tape a bit. You talked about the 2022 election. You talked about it occurring in the aftermath of the repeal of Roe v. Wade. Obviously true. Certainly it had an impact. But a lot of Trump-backed candidates that were clearly less electable than the establishment Republican candidates that were backed by other segments of the GOP, a lot of folks pointed to that as a reason that the GOP underperformed in 2022, arguing that Trump did not endorse good candidates, and the ones that he did push across the finish line ultimately lost races that the Republican Party could have picked up.
Yeah, I mean, you can just look at South Carolina alone. Trump-endorsed candidates have a mixed bag rate of success. Look at Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. It was probably the most famous race. He somehow got beat by John Fetterman, who literally could not speak English at the time of the election. Fetterman, I have to admit, I don't agree with a lot of his policy, but he's been very interesting to watch since he's been in the Senate, because as he's recovered and got more blood flow to his brain or whatever, he's taken some very interesting atypical policy positions. Obviously, his outfits are fit for FITSNews, given the crap we usually wear on camera.
Look at you, man.
I know. I'm showing Senator Fetterman up today, but usually we're sporting similar looks to him.
Well, let me ask it to you this way, Dylan. Is Trump's decision to mollify this centrist group that everyone's fighting for, the independents on the issue of abortion, is this an attempt to kind of throw them a bone at the expense of the hardcore right flank of the party? Do you see that as a sign that Trump V2 is going to be similar to Trump V1 in terms of caving to the DC establishment?
I don't know that Trump personally ever was a strong pro-life person. I think he took the position that, like Bill Clinton did in the 90s, just the kind of rational view, which is that ending a human life is not a good thing. However, if you do it at an early enough stage, it's not as morally bad as if you do it later. And, there are certain situations in which it is appropriate. This is a position that I would say Democrat, Republican, 90% of the country 20 years ago would agree with. And he recognizes that. And that's and to align yourself with a group that takes a position which 5-10% of the country agrees with when you need to win every single vote possible is just asinine.
Well, let's go brass tacks here, because you said something this week, and I want to pin you down a little bit on it, because I would argue that, okay, yes, politically, pragmatically, electorally, this is a great decision by Trump, and that all the people that he's pissing off are people that have literally nowhere else to go. They're going to vote for him regardless. And also he argued that, hey, we're only having this discussion because I put 3 people in the court that gave the right to legislate this issue back to the states. But you said something a moment ago, more or less morally correct later versus earlier in a pregnancy. If you are a supporter of the right to life, how do we assign moral equivalency to an abortion at one stage versus another?
You know, I don't know. That's not my decision to make. That's not my argument. If that's how you feel, I respect that. You're allowed to hold that opinion, but I can completely understand why, when you're trying to win a general election in a nation of 300 million people, you have to acknowledge that you're not going to win that election if you take a very hardline stance on a very controversial issue.
Even more brass tacks, so let's talk about this. The idea that we are looking at the state-by-state regulation of abortion. Obviously, a lot of red states are going to impose more stringent restrictions, as South Carolina has done. There was a huge debate about that here in the Palmetto State. It cost several Republican senators their jobs because they went a little too far. Again, we're spectrum language here, a little far to the left on the issue, cost them their jobs. But Dylan, let me ask you this question. The blue states, pragmatically, do Republicans not want to support abortion on demand in blue states? I mean, answer me that question. Brass tacks.
Maybe they're federalists. Maybe they want to say, let the blue states legislate as they want to legislate. I don't want the blue states to force their ideas of how government should work down on us at the federal level, and we shouldn't force our opinions of how government should work on them at the federal level.
So you called this a long time ago, everything that's happening now with Joe Biden. And I wanted to ask you this question because we talked about it last week, the possibility, the chance that Biden is convinced somehow to give up this bid. Where are you right now on that percentage chance? What percentage chance do you think there is that Joe Biden gives up his bid for the presidency?
I believe last time you asked me this, I predicted 50-50, and I'm going to stick with that number. I think he's incredibly obstinate, as we've seen by the fact that he's still in the race at this point. That being said, I could also see the collective weight of the DNC, the media. You know, they did not just pivot on a dime on this debate and just suddenly notice what has been available for anybody with eyeballs to see since about 2019. They did not just all collectively notice this at the same time at the debate without there being coordination in the back room.
Yeah, incredible cognitive dissonance. And also, speaking of cognitive dissonance, I do want to point this out. I wrote a line in our story about Trump and the abortion debate. I do think there is some cognitive dissonance for Republican primary voters to toss 3 female GOP senators for showing a little nod to the center on abortion, and yet Trump does it and no repercussions for him from them. So I think that's a little interesting, a little cognitive dissonance there. But let me ask you this, though, Dylan, as we look toward 2024, Trump's edge in the swing states, elections held today, who wins?
Joe Biden.
Why? How do you say that? They
Donald.
rig it?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. No, I still think that the chances of this election, however they do it, ballot harvesting, I mean, none of the loopholes which were open last time, which legal or illegal, I don't know, you know, that I don't really think it ever got properly litigated. I don't think that any of those loopholes were closed. What makes folks think that we won't see a repeat of 2020?
Wow.
Because Joe Biden was just about as mentally able back then as he is now.
Well, your predictions have been on, man. I'm not gonna argue too hard with you, man. You've been on. Also, one last note as we close out this segment on politics. Here in South Carolina, the leading Democrat in the Palmetto State, Jim Clyburn, the guy who was rewarded with the first in the nation primary by backing Joe Biden to the hilt. Not surprisingly, he's come out in support of Joe Biden, one of the highest ranking Democrats in Washington, to go on the record saying that Joe Biden should remain the Democratic nominee. Clyburn did that this week, a significant show of support for the incumbent president from a ranking Democrat. Dylan, can't wait to see where this goes. Obviously, uncharted waters for this republic. Any predictions before we close out?
Yeah, I have two final points. One, Jim Clyburn. It's interesting that you interpret his comments this week as support of Joe Biden. To me, it was towing the party line and towing the CBC Congressional Black Caucus line of formally supporting Biden. But he also gave comment that he would be open to Harris and, you know, expressed his support of Vice President Harris. Take that as you will. And also there have been reports that behind closed doors, he's as panicked as everybody else. And you don't let reports like that. Leaks don't just happen.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, we know we're the ones who report leaks. They happen because people call you on the phone and express how they feel to you and then say, but please don't put my name behind this.
Yeah.
And that's when you report sources close to Clyburn said.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's a very good point. Well, and again, this is such a rapidly unfolding scenario. You know, we could be sitting
Right.
here
By the
next-
time that folks
Yeah.
are watching or listening to this situation could completely change. And I'm a degenerate Twitter addict. So this has been a very rough couple of weeks for me because every 30 seconds there is a new interesting piece of information on Twitter. I mean, I think this weekend I'm literally going to delete it off of my phone and not open my laptop because for my own sanity, I need to take some days away from it. I think more people in our profession should do that so that they remain normal human beings. But it has been one of the most fast and furious news cycles that we've seen since the 2016 election cycle.
No, you're right. And in fact, by this time next week, I mean, it's possible we could be sitting here talking about a new Democratic nominee.
And I want to address one more point. You brought up the Katrina Shealy, the sister senators getting axed, and Republican voters not seemingly holding Trumps to the same standard. And I would like to point out that when folks consider candidates for state level elections versus federal level elections, you need to consider them with a completely different set of parameters as far as what you want to vote for. Because if you believe that the appropriate place to set policy is at the state level, then you got to make sure the people you're putting in your state house believe what you believe at a very close level on these policy issues, which is why I don't think it's hypocritical to say, I want my state senator to believe what I believe about abortion, but not necessarily care so much about what your president believes if you truly believe that that policy should be set at the state level.
Well, also we'll got to factor at some point in what is the ultimate intensity level on this issue, because again, I'm a guy staunchly pro-life, but would it be a litmus test issue for me is, for example, if a candidate comes out on an issue that I'm more impacted by on my bottom line, is abortion going to make me, override that underlying financial interest? I don't know. But like we said earlier, a lot of these Republicans, they just don't have anywhere to go on that issue. And Trump knows it.
Oh, yeah.
So, end of the day, smart move by the president.
Indeed.
Or former president, future president. We'll find out. As we continue to follow this election, folks, know that we're always going to give you our best take on what's happening. But more importantly, these microphones are always open to anybody with an intelligent take, whether it's agreeing with us, disagreeing
Left,
with us.
right, center. We're happy to host a conversation with anybody who's happy to have a relevant, and rational debate.
Absolutely. We welcome perspectives from points all along that ideological spectrum. Always have, always will. That's what the open microphone is about. And again, that sort of open debate about what's actually happened, a far cry from the cover-up you've seen from the mainstream press. Again, intellectual honesty, it matters. We're going to always promote it here at FITSNews. Dylan, thanks for sitting down with me. I love these political segments. We'll see where we are next week with the D.C. drama.
Who knows where it will go?
All right, that's a wrap for this week's edition. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. And as always, I want to thank everybody who is supporting our work by subscribing to FITSNews.com. Again, it's only $8. It empowers everything that we do here at FITSNews. So if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to FITSNews.com. Stay tuned for a very special episode of the Week in Review. Next week, we will be on location down in Charleston, South Carolina, the Holy City. We're going to take the show on the road. We're going to sit down with Lauren Taylor, one of our resident experts on a whole host of legal issues. Lauren and I are going to sit down and recap a ton of the cases that we're following. Stay tuned for that on next week's show. And until then, catch you next time on the Week in Review.